So we have Geneva on Skype. The head of advocacy at Human Rights House, Florian Irminger, has joined us. Florian, please tell us how much do you know, how much the international community and human rights organization know about the current situation with the persecutions and all the human rights violations in Crimea, especially regarding the recent cases?
Well, wow, that's quite a wide question. You know, what I want to underline is that just recently the European Parliament adopted the resolution focused on the Crimean Tatar, but not only, really underlining that basically since the illegal annexation of Crimea, the region has, through Russianization, gone through, you know, a widespread human rights violations from all categories, and of course the Crimean Tatar, the first one really being touched here. So what I wanted to say by this example is to say that the international community has repeatedly, in a way, said that, you know, the situation in Crimea has to go back to what it used to be, and that since the annexation, massive human rights violations have occurred. And I mentioned the European Parliament that just adopted this resolution. We are actively working for the United Nations General Assembly to again adopt a resolution on Crimea. They did so, the UN General Assembly, in 2014, in which it found that the annexation was illegal, in which it reaffirmed that Crimea is fully part of Ukraine. But we want the UN General Assembly to go further, to not only reassert the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but also to assert what happened from a human rights perspective since the annexation. What does it mean for the rights of the people? You know, all of those aspects have not yet been covered enough by the United Nations, and we hope to get there soon.
How often do your monitors visit Crimea, and how easy it is for them?
Yeah, it's very difficult to visit Crimea, and you know, it's difficult from many sides. Human rights NGOs have established cooperation between Ukrainian and Russian human rights activists to actually try to get to Crimea. And here, what I really want to say is that we all need to push on the Ukrainian government to ensure that journalists, human rights defenders, lawyers have access to Crimea. From the Ukrainian side, it has become increasingly difficult to access Crimea. The allowance system, if you want to access it legally from the Ukrainian side, the way to be allowed this whole permitted situation, you know, on the long term will not work well. And this has to be reformed. It has to be made easier to allow easy access to Crimea for human rights defenders from the Ukrainian side. We know, you know, obviously, that it is extremely difficult for anybody who does not have Russian visa to get to Crimea, but we also want to respect that, respecting the territorial integrity, we want to access Crimea through Ukraine. So the Ukrainian side has to facilitate that for journalists, human rights defenders, and lawyers. So to date, I don't want to give any numbers at this stage due to securing people who actually work from Ukrainian and Russian NGOs in Crimea. To date, access is very difficult. There are some people working there that bring information out, but you know, it is extremely difficult, and it's basically impossible to bring internationals at this stage to Crimea.
But Florian, I'm very curious because I've just come from Crimea and was traveling there from the Ukrainian side, and it's the first time we hear about any complication to get there. What we understand that anybody who travels there should have a Russian visa. That's what we know, but we haven't heard about, you know, I haven't seen any difficulties in getting there. Well, besides, you know, you have always the risk to work on the ground.
Yeah. Well, if you are, for example, let's say you are a Russian human rights defender, or, for example, a Russian lawyer defending people in courts in Crimea, and you're basically the only ones being able to actually defend people in courts. If you want to go to Crimea and respecting the Ukrainian control of it, you would have to go to Kiev to get an authorization. That will take quite some time. Getting to Kiev at the moment is not easy. That will take quite some time, and then it will also be quite difficult to actually get it, and at the end of the day to get to Crimea. And for internationals, it is just as difficult if you want to get the authorization from the Ukrainian side. How difficult it is today for Ukrainians themselves to get to Crimea, I wouldn't know.
Yeah, because in general it's not difficult because you don't need any different paper. It's usually just a question on the with the Russian border guards. And what are your major concerns? What are the biggest issues, if you speak about the human rights violations?
Well, the major concern is really the fact that legislation, the judiciary, the law enforcement have basically have been Russianized, meaning today Crimea resembles more and more to a sort of no-law zone. For Crimeans to have recourse, for example, to the European Court of Human Rights has become, if not difficult, basically impossible. Who has effective jurisdiction is not the question. The question is how can you actually use that jurisdiction? So that is really kind of the main concern. Comes along with that oppression and repression of any kind of dissent, be it political dissent, of course, to the Russian takeover, or be it the dissent from more of a linguistic perspective or even from a minority perspective. And there I come to the Crimean Tatar. What is happening in Crimea, from what we get as information to the Tatar community, is basically absolute oppression. And what has just been decided about the Majlis making that terrorist organization, criminal organization, is even worse. So in a way, what we have seen, if we want to take a broader picture rather than just small events, a broader picture, from a broad picture, what has happened to Crimea is a complete shutdown of its civil society. It is a complete control and takeover police-wise and from a foreign police. So, it is an absolute kind of oppression, and we have considered that Crimea has, in a way, become a no-law zone.
You have mentioned several international organizations that you make aware of the situation with human rights in Crimea, but what sort of contact do you have with Russian authorities, and to which extent you are able to influence them?
Well, I have to say that influencing the Russian authorities as a human rights organization has, since at least 2012, become, if not impossible, extremely difficult. So we really don't aim at pushing the Russian authorities that much. We aim at pushing them through the international organizations. That's why we try to make sure that the OSCE, that the UN and so on, try to get access to Crimea. And again, if they want to get access to Crimea, they need official authorization. So that's what we're trying to do. We have worked on the Russian Federation when the Federation was reviewed at the UN Human Rights Committee back in March 2015. We worked at that level, and also the committee then recognized that the annexation is illegal, and that all of the various human rights problems that are happening there since have been recognized by the UN Human Rights Committee, which is an expert body. But we are not able to directly work with the Russian authorities.
And Florian, I've talked to the human rights lawyers who are protecting Crimean Tatars, Muslims who are accused of terrorism and accused of, being more or less believers, practicing or promoting a political Islam. That's what it is. But what is their concern that in generally in current world, because of the the whole issue with international terrorism, it's a sensitive topics, and the human rights defenders all over the world think that this is a sensitive topic to protect, Islamists, to protect those who believe in the political Islam. What would you say? Is it really a sensitive topic? What would be, do you share their concern that in this case, these cases won't be promoted, won't be supported as much as the others?
Well, we know that counterterrorism has been used excessively, and I think I don't fully understand the question very well, but basically the point here is to say that anybody has exactly the same rights, whether what the accusation is. And I don't know about these specific cases that you mentioned, and I don't know in which jurisdiction they are and so on. So I didn't fully understand the question well.
So, but I would still try to clarify. So there are the human rights defenders who defend the people in Crimea, the practicing Muslim, who are accused of either terrorism by different means, but more or less the concern of the human rights defenders, because these cases are connected to the people who are practicing Muslim, who really accused of, practicing political Islam, and this is the internationally today we speak in the terms of counterterrorism or operation, that these cases won't be so promoted because people feel they're sensitive. It's always dubious if we speak about the Islamist. Do you think that it's really that human rights organization probably wouldn't speak that much, that these cases are probably more complicated to protect and to make public, to gather more support for these cases?
Well, at least we at the Human Rights House Network, we have been very clear. Crimean Tatar, the community as such, its political bodies, for example, the mages, we've been very clear in saying that accusations of extremism, accusations of terrorism against them are accusations that are bogus. And we don't need to find multiple reasons here. These are people who have a religious belief, fine with that. These are people who have political stand, fine with that, and these are people who are not advocating violence. So what is extremist and what is terrorist in there? That has been our position from the beginning on of the repression against the Tatar community, and that actually has been reinforced by the European Parliament. The European Parliament very well said that Tatar community is being branded, meaning it's just being named something. That doesn't mean that anything has been wrongdoing. It's only naming, has been branded extremist, has been accused of terrorism. And I think that's a strategy that actually we see from the Russian Federation for the last 2 years. So we have been very clear on this, and from the partners we work with, both in Ukraine and in Russia, from the human rights movements, they have been very clear on that. So the only thing that this goes back to is there's a no-law zone in Crimea. So these people are not enjoying a free trial if they're being put on trial in Crimea, and that is actually the real issue here.
Okay, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.